All right. Hey, everyone. I'm Melon Pants. I'm a co-host of the Bias and Birth channel and the host of the Melon Pants Rants channel. Today I'm here with Naturalist Ted, and we're discussing topics such as GSC, which would be generic subjective continuity, David Benatar's asymmetry argument, ethical frameworks, as well as some antinatalism and extinction. My primary focus online revolves around discussions regarding extinction and extinctionism, as well as singlehood and eternal bachelorism. Ted takes interest in philosophical topics such as generic subjective continuity, free will, morality, and the nature of consciousness. While not a trained philosopher, his stance is that the very first philosopher in the world, whoever that might have been, had no one to train them, yet they were still a philosopher. He's also a paper cutting artist living in America. He and I both separately make videos, and here we have a video together discussing the topics mentioned at the beginning. Now, with that said, here we are.
It's important that before we start that you understand, you have a very firm grasp, you completely understand generic subjective continuity. Generic subjective continuity reveals that if you weren't born, then instead of this life, it would have just been some other life. If it isn't one life, it's another. So that kind of defeats the whole point of the asymmetry argument that David Benatar put forth in his Better Never to Have Been book. Because his whole, the idea of the asymmetry argument is to say that it would be better to not exist. But for it to be better to not exist, there has to be something that is better. And he suggests that non-existence is better. But that's a fallacy in that for non-existence to not exist to be better, there would have to be, it would demand there to be a state which is appreciated by the person that does not exist. Otherwise, Benatar has nothing to offer. And if he has nothing to offer, then there's nothing to say. So he shouldn't even have anything to say if he has nothing to offer. And I realize that generic subjective continuity does not eliminate or make futile all antinatalism. It just it only makes futile the asymmetry argument-based antinatalism. The idea that not being born would result in some kind of protective state for these hypothetical non-existent beings that people imagine. People will go as far as saying, my son is in a protective state because he doesn't exist. And I will ask, how do you know you would have had a son? Or what about all the other infinite possible kids that you would have, could have, or Siamese twins, or hermaphrodites, or just stillborns, and just the possibilities are endless and infinite. So why does this person imagine just this one? They're imagining a almost like a phantom person, like this ghost they have in their head that is in this state of peace because they don't exist. It's nonsensical. So generic subjective continuity reveals that if a person doesn't exist, that there's no state of peacefulness or anything worth mentioning. As I said, if I weren't born, then instead of this life, it would have been some other life, because other lives were born at my time of birth. So I wouldn't be in some kind of black void or anything. And Benatar's point is that all lives are bad. No life is should be considered a good thing to have happened. And I've done surveys on antinatalist groups on Facebook asking, if you weren't born you, would you have rather been born, say, Elon Musk or some other very wealthy person that doesn't suffer too much in life, or perhaps an animal or anything that, if you could pick, what life would you pick? And the answer is always no life. They want non-existence. They want endless non-experience, endless no lifeness, or whatever you want to call it. And many call it nothingness. And so there's this idea of this unending blankness or non-experience. And so you'd have to ask, what is sustaining this endless non-experience, this what can only be envisioned as a black void, a silent black void, where it's kind of giving attributes to unconsciousness. Like if you're put under anesthesia, that unconsciousness, the period of time you're unconscious, doesn't have any attributes. It doesn't have any anything to refer to. It's just, from your point of view, it's skipped over. It's like unconsciousness is a proverbial time machine.
So I have my own problems with the asymmetry argument, which would just be its lack of context. It doesn't really specify what such and such is good for, what such and such is bad for. The same also applies to better, like the statement better never to have been. We have to ask, well, better for what? What is it better for? And what I can clearly glean from it is that, so Benatar assigns a negative value towards the presence of negative feeling. So the more absence of negative feeling, the better it is for the goal set by his priority value. And that can be factually the case. And so the more accomplishment of that goal, it happens, and there doesn't really have to be an observer for that to factually happen, and for it to factually be better for that goal that is set, for that specific goal. Like, so, better for the absence of negative feeling, it is, just factually better for the absence of negative feeling. And in regards to people describing non-existence as some sort of peaceful bliss, I think people are using that in a metaphorical sense. I don't think that most antinatalists are believing it to be a literal peace, because I think most antinatalists acknowledge that without sentience, it's without sentience. So there's no experience. There's nobody experiencing peace or anything like that, or any relief from negative feeling. It's just that the negative feeling is not there, and so that is better for the goal set by that priority value. So they determine, okay, yeah, I prefer this. And even if they're not around to witness that preference being accomplished, that preference is still factually accomplished. So the word better is just a word to describe more benefit going towards something as opposed to less benefit going towards something. So something can be factually better for a goal. Something can factually help push towards a goal compared to something else. So the statement better never to have been, it is better never to have been for the goal of the absence of negative feeling. And so on the point of preventing a birth from happening, that there's just going to be another birth popping up somewhere as long as sentience is around, I think that can apply to any sort of ethical justice. Like there's always going to be murders as long as sentience is around. But I don't think that entails that we just shouldn't bother with trying to stop any sort of murder. The idea is that if we can't reduce it completely, surely we can reduce it to some degree, or like to the best of our ability, reduce it, enough that, um, it's better than having it not reduced for that goal.
What doesn't make sense to me is Benatar's statement that there would be an absence of suffering if I didn't exist. Um, if I were never born, there would be an absence of suffering. And what I'm saying is that he is saying that this absence would be a sort of positive absence of suffering, that there would be kind of a metaphysical bubble of non-suffering, of this experience of not of a lack of suffering in this metaphysical bubble that would have been me, that I would have filled this bubble had I been born. But because, let's say in this situation, I wasn't born, that there is somehow this perpetual blankness as opposed to um, what I've been explaining, generic subjective continuity. If I hadn't been born, then there wouldn't be a something that could be preferable or considered better, or uh, the whole reason he wrote his book, Better Never to Have Been. And it there's just no preferable. If I hadn't been born, then instead of this life, it would have been some other life. Um, and I can run through the thought experiment that I came up with. If there were no life whatsoever in the universe, and then consciousness suddenly ensued, then it doesn't matter where that consciousness is coming from, which brain is doing it. There is consciousness. There is no lack of consciousness. There's no you to impede or block that conscious experience that is occurring. That's all there is. That's the only experience there is. There is no lack of experience. There is experience, and that is the experience. There is no there's no state in which there's somebody being protected from that experience, because you would have to exist in order to protect you from this one and only experience that exists in this thought experiment. Um, so I could reveal to you right now that, oh, it turns out that that one and only consciousness is you. Or, it could be somebody else, but it doesn't matter. It's just that it is a brain that's doing consciousness, or whatever else might be doing this consciousness. There is consciousness versus there not being any consciousness. So, and as far as the idea that that people are using this better as a metaphor, I don't think that's the case. Otherwise, they wouldn't keep using the words better, or and so on and so forth. They don't select the word better arbitrarily. They select it just as a poet would select a word that best expresses his or her desired expression of what they're trying to convey. So, and if I really push people on this, and I've done it a few times, I've had people admit, yes, it is peaceful. They imagine it would be peaceful if they didn't exist. Most are not willing to take it that far. They just repeat that I wouldn't exist, and of course me not existing would be better. It makes no sense for them to pick that word, peaceful or better, unless they actually meant it. As I recently said, they're not just throwing a dart at a dictionary and landing on whatever word, just choosing a random word. they specifically choose this word because they believe it best conveys uh, their feelings about it. I compare the idea of there existing an absence of suffering if I had not been born to um, pointing at a plate full of carrots, and you just point at this one little spot where a carrot is not sitting on that plate, and you say, look, there's an absence of carrots. Clearly, there is no absence of carrots. The plate is full of them except for that one little quarter-inch spot that this person is pointing at. The same goes with I just explained that thought experiment where there's just one consciousness in the entire universe, and so there is consciousness. Um, so if that consciousness was suffering, we're not going to point everywhere else in the universe and say, look at all this lack of suffering. Clearly, there is suffering. There is no one else that exists to be protected from the suffering that exists. But there would have to be some sort of, I like to refer to them as like metaphysical bubbles of positive absence, uh, like an existing absence of this almost tangible absence of suffering. It would have to exist in some form to even bring it up. And Benatar says that he doesn't mean it's better for the person that doesn't exist, and he does so. He says it's not literally better. He goes on to dance around with words, describing, trying to explain this, but he makes it clear that he believes it's preferable. So he once again, there's this signpost on the road pointing to this thing that he denies is better for anyone, yet he keeps pointing at it saying it's preferable. What is this it which is preferable? Um, it doesn't make any sense. I say it's the asymmetry argument is a deipity. It's selling something that just isn't there, that isn't available. It's snake oil. It's you have this box, and he says this thing inside the box is so great, I want to sell it to you. And you look in the box, and there isn't anything in there. And for some to say, well, that's just the point. There's nothing in the box. Yes, but nothing isn't better, and it isn't something that can be preferable. It's not something that can block experience. If there is experience anywhere in the universe, then that will be the experience. That's what's experienced. It won't be you experiencing it, but just the mere fact that there exists experience at all in the universe. So if everyone in the universe died right now, but then say 1 billion years or one day later or however long after we've all died, somewhere else in the universe, through whatever processes brought us to exist, somewhere else in the universe, some sentient organism eventually comes to exist, then after we've all died, there's clearly consciousness. It's not that we didn't transmigrate into that being. It's just a simple fact that there's going to be consciousness after we died in this thought experiment. And so there's no escaping that experience because there's no you to escape it. And so it's imposed. Just as, you know, your life was imposed, you didn't exist. to stop your life from being imposed. So you didn't exist, and then a life was imposed. And there was nothing you could do about a life being imposed because you didn't exist. And that's it's important to recognize that that's all you are, is a life in a generic sense. Like, I'm a life, you're a life, my cat is a life, everyone you know is a life. So if we strip away everything that makes us unique individuals and see ourselves as just a life, and then we go back to uh, the lifeless universe thought experiment, and then a life comes to exist. What does it matter if it's the life that's listening to this audio right now, or if it's some other life that is the one to end that non-existence, to the life that is the one that's imposed? So my point is, there's just no escaping one life or another. Consciousness is imposed one way or the other. Death is not an escape. Not being born is not an escape, because non-existence didn't stop a life from being imposed. So that's just, I mean, the evidence is all around us. For each and every being alive, non-existence didn't stop a life from being imposed.
So what that would mean for your the murder example, it would be as if we rewound time and that same murder just happened over and over again.
I'm definitely not advocating for people to procreate. Um, I'm only critiquing and revealing that the asymmetry argument is nonsensical. It's deeply flawed. So it's important to remember that Benatar isn't saying that you would have. He doesn't point out specific lives in the asymmetry argument. He's applying it to each and every life in general, consciousness in general. Just, you could look at everyone as just blank faces, just a generic human outline, kind of like you see on the crosswalk signs or something, just like, or the bathroom signs, just like, just these generic humans. And he's saying that no life is better than a life. But he doesn't point out, he doesn't say Stacy shouldn't, as far as the asymmetry argument is concerned, he doesn't point out individual lives and explain why this specific person would have been better off not born, or give other examples of individual births, particular situations. He's just saying it applies to everyone. It applies to Elon Musk as much as it applies to you and me, as much as it applies to, the worst life on Earth and the best life on Earth. As far as lowering populations goes, I don't think the asymmetry argument is really concerned with that. I know Benatar is concerned with that in other parts of his books, but the asymmetry argument by itself isn't about that. There are plenty of reasons to lower situations that would it would be best for us to lower populations. Again, that's not what the asymmetry argument is saying.
Okay, I'll try to cover all of the points together. So when you say there's no preferable, for example, there is within the context of goals set by values. So something is preferable towards something. Like, let's say, a goal is set. Somebody has a priority ethical value. And in this case, when it comes to Benatar, he's saying, okay, my priority ethical value is the absence of negative feeling. And so this instance in where there is an absence of negative feeling, that is preferable for this goal. Not necessarily preferable for, this person here, but just preferable towards this goal that I am setting from my priority values. And to say that there's no lack of experience, there's lack of experience outside of every presence of experience. So anywhere that there is no experience, there is lack of experience. So like with the absence of carrots example that you gave, where there's like an absence of carrots on a plate. Well, like let's say if I set a goal, right? Like I'm a being experiencing existence, and I set this goal of wanting there to be an absence of carrots, and there's carrots on the plate. Well, here on this little portion, there's an absence of carrots. Now, the more absence of carrots there is, the better, and, of course, like I said earlier, better is contextual. So it's better for the goal. So the more that the goal is reached, the better it is for that goal, being reached. And you said, you talked about better being used as a metaphor. Well, I didn't say that they use better as a metaphor, but rather just when they're describing non-existence as peace, I believe that they're using it in a metaphorical sense. Now, you can get individuals, of course. I'm not denying the fact that there will be some individuals that genuinely think of it as a peaceful, blissful experience, and I think that's just faulty logic. But yeah, I would say any reasonable antinatalist would not, call non-existence peace. And when they're using it in a metaphorical sense, what they're using it to convey is just the absence of negative feeling. Of course, peace typically means the absence of negative feeling being experienced, but here they're using it in a metaphorical sense to mean just an absence of negative feeling, regardless of whether or not it's experienced. And so an experienced absence wouldn't be required for maintaining pursuit of furthering a goal that prioritizes the absence regardless of whether or not it's experienced. So if the goal was more experienced absence, so positive feeling, which, the inverse of negative feeling while you're sentient and alive, if that were the goal, then that point would make sense to me. But since that's not the goal of antinatalists, it to me it just doesn't ring true. Because experienced absence isn't required for that goal, because the goal is for there just be an absence of negative feeling regardless of whether or not it is experienced. And so when David Benatar says it is preferable, he means preferable towards the goal of the absence. And the it is the lack of negative feeling supporting the currently held goal set by a priority ethical value within his mind. So he's saying, this is preferable, for my goal of there being no negative feeling, less negative feeling in the world. Let's see here. What else? So another thing is the idea of there's no escaping more birth popping up. Like if there's potential for the birth to pop up, like let's say we got rid of all, sentient existence, but somewhere down the line, more sentience pops up. So the no escaping more birth doesn't rule out a preference of less birth. If that preference were unworthy, we would have to then ask, what is it unworthy for? Unworthy for what? So again, furthering the context. And speaking on context, I think the only real flaws with the asymmetry argument is its lack of context in talking about, good for this, bad for this, and such. And I think it's in regards to consensus from what I gleaned from it. I think it's basically saying, most people would consider this good, would have the value judgment, quote unquote, of this being good and this being bad. And regards to all the other points, I don't think it's really flaws of the asymmetry argument. I think that those are the flaws with the asymmetry argument. I guess another way you would probably like word your point, and I guess you could correct me if I'm wrong, is that the lack of negative feeling without it being experienced, like with no experience or experiencing the lack of negative feeling, that the lack of negative feeling in the context of it just being a pure lack of negative feeling without an experiencer experiencing that lack of negative feeling, that it makes it unworthy. But then you have to remember, well, what does it make it unworthy for? It doesn't really make it unworthy towards the goal set there, because I mean, the goal being accomplished is just outside of an observer witnessing it being accomplished. Now, the goal might have been set by an observer, but it being accomplished can still be factual, regardless of whether or not there's an observer to witness it being accomplished. And so another way to think about this is that it's just all based on ethical frameworks, right? So it's like, somebody has consideration for others. They see somebody going through some sort of intense suffering or whatever, and then it manifests this value within their, brain where they go, oh, well, I don't like that they have to experience negative feeling, so I'm setting this value of preferring the absence of negative feeling. And then that absence of negative feeling happening, like let's say the observer that held this value dies, and they no longer have the ability to hold the value because there is no one around to have any ability to do anything, so they're gone. Well, the absence of negative feeling being propagated, or the absence of negative feeling being furthered within the aggregate, still factually happens regardless of whether or not any observers are around to take notice of it or acknowledge it. And yeah, so it just all exists within ethical frameworks. So, somebody sets a goal from their values that they set, and and then things can be accomplished for that. And then I think a lot of people, and I think the points that you're trying to make as well, or from what it sounds like, is that, well, because there's no experiencer around to experience their lack of negative feeling, that it makes it an unworthy goal to set. But then, unworthy for what,
It's important to notice that Benatar isn't talking about any particular lives. He isn't saying it's good specifically that Ted, don't exist. The asymmetry argument is about life in general, and I lay that out in a thought experiment here in my response in my notes. But I'll get to that, and it should make it clear that why him focusing on life in general, and why GSC makes his goal futile, because a life is still imposed. Even if you weren't born, a life would still have been imposed. So not being born is futile, as a way to obtain something Benatar refers to as preferable. And so the goal of achieving this, quote, preferable is made an obtainable. This, quote, preferable is, because of GSC, revealed to be a mirage. I believe that if an antinatalist or anyone sees that there isn't peace, or a sort of experience of no experience before birth, that they should arrive at GSC, even if they don't call it that realization of GSC. They don't refer to it as GSC. They might call it something else. To not have that realization is to be stuck in the I don't know realm. And that's why I do what I do, which is preach the gospel of GSC. you say experienced absence isn't the goal, and it's not what antinatalists of the Benatarian persuasion want, and that it isn't required. But then you said that when Benatar says it is preferable towards the goal of the absence, it is the lack of negative feeling. He's saying this is preferable toward the goal of there being no negative feeling, less negative feeling in the world, numerically. But this is irrelevant for the asymmetry argument because we could make it so there's only one consciousness in the universe, and so there still exists suffering. And that reveals the futility of the asymmetry's goal, because the desire is to achieve no experience whatsoever. A perpetual, unending lack of experience, a sort of endless blankness. This is what I'm hearing when he says the absence or the lack and it. These things just don't exist for us to obtain. But you contradict yourself saying that that's not the goal and not what antinatalists want. But then you say it is the goal, towards the goal of the absence, the lack of negative feeling, is what you said. What absence? What absence is there to obtain if a life is imposed either way because of GSC? Again, the asymmetry argument is about life in general. I don't see how lowering the number of sentient organisms matters when a life is still imposed if I were not born. Me not being born did no good. Imagine a universe that's full of millions of copies of you who are all Benatarian antinatalists, and one of the yous dies. Then because of GSC, that death is followed by yet another you, which is an antinatalist. And then that you also dies, and that death is also followed by another you. There's just no escaping. There's no achieving an absence of experience, and therefore no escaping suffering, because it's just you. And it just keeps going. In this thought experiment, it's you. And it's important to realize that every brain is just a kind of a self-generator, a consciousness generator, a locus of experience, a center of experience,
as Tom Clark often puts it.
And each one of us refers to ourselves as I, and you call everyone else you. This is because everyone is a self. And so the self is still, in this thought experiment, born even if you don't exist. If it isn't one I, it's another I. And this is true outside of this thought experiment. I'm an I, you're an I, and so on and so forth. So if it isn't one I, it's another. That's what I mean by if it isn't one life, it's another. Now, to address your final point of not being born, still accomplishing the goal, even if that lack of existing is not appreciated by the person that doesn't exist, I say that without the non-existent person appreciating not existing, where's the benefit? Where's the reward for me not being born, if me not being born still results in some other life being imposed? You say the goal being accomplished is outside of an observer of the goal being accomplished. What good does it do except for making people that decide not to have kids feel better about themselves because they mistakenly believe they've stopped a life from being imposed, but they haven't. It's an illusion. So I don't think the asymmetry argument is saying that it's about lowering populations, lower that kind of numerically stopping consciousnesses. It's about the elimination of conscious experience altogether. And so this necessitates a need for there to be some kind of endless blankness as opposed to experience itself. What Tom Clark refers to as an experience of no experience, an ongoing lack of experience, perpetual non-experience. That it's just not achievable. And as I pointed out in the thought experiment, if it isn't one you, it's just another you. So it's just not being obtained. There's nothing to talk about. It doesn't make sense to say the absence at all in any regard. It just doesn't exist. Like I said earlier, it's like selling a package that doesn't have anything in it. He's saying, here's this thing that's preferable, but when you really investigate it, there is no thing that's preferable. So what's he pointing to that's preferable? What's he selling? He isn't selling anything. And if there isn't anything that's obtainable or preferable that exists to achieve, then it doesn't make sense to even talk about anything, to even bring up this idea. That it's a completely empty argument.
All right, so I don't intend to defend the asymmetry argument specifically since it lacks a lot of context to really gain a full picture, but I am interested in putting forth points regarding absence and GSC. Now, in regards to GSC, preventing a birth does do actual prevention. So a birth starts out as an idea, and then that idea is prevented from evolving into something more. And another birth popping up is just taking its place, but it doesn't change the fact that that birth was actually prevented. The popping up of other life doesn't render the preference futile or even the action of preventing birth, especially when more birth isn't even necessarily guaranteed. Now, if David Benatar is saying non-existence is good for life in general, in regards to life in general, what is it good for? The absence of negative feeling. It's a benefit towards that ethical concern. Now, there existing a preferable outcome in respect to an endpoint or goal doesn't contradict the idea that antinatalists hold the goal of less negative feeling, regardless of it being experienced. So they're not desiring purely an experienced absence, just absence in general. You also mentioned the desire being obtaining no experience whatsoever. Yet the more lack of experience, the closer that desire is to being fulfilled. And it can't be guaranteed, again, that more experience eventually takes up the same amount that was prevented. You also say that there's a contradiction because there's no absence due to GSC, but there is an absence where there isn't presence. GSC doesn't stop that presence from being successfully reduced or the goal getting closer to reaching its conclusion. And you not being born did do good, quote unquote, in the sense of good for preventing what could have been and good for this goal. Another birth taking its place doesn't rule out that this potential birth didn't take place. The same also applies to something like murder, for example. Stopping murder isn't futile just because another may be bound to happen. Again, murder starts out as an idea as well. And so something being futile or unworthy requires context as well. So it has to be futile or unworthy towards something. And I assume in this case it's towards its ability for success. But the ability for success isn't rendered out in this case.
I have to ask, what do you mean by their desiring absence in general? What is absence in general? And I agree that if a specific person isn't born, that specific life will not be experienced. But then this is where GSC comes into play. If I weren't born, then there wouldn't be a positive absence where that would impede some other life from being imposed, as opposed to the life that was going to be imposed. So it, like I keep saying, if it isn't one life, it's another. So there is no positive absence that can be obtained. So my lack of existing did nothing to stop a life from being imposed. Yeah, we can lower populations, human populations, and that will reduce suffering numerically. We can lower murder rates, but murder isn't really comparable to what GSC does. So if all life in the universe, except for one, ended, then it would just be that life that's imposed, as opposed to the other lives being imposed. Those lives that no longer exist aren't enjoying, or not, that one and only life is not impeded by their lack of existing. Just as my lack of existing didn't impede a life from being imposed. So if I didn't exist, because there are other lives that were born and existed back then, one of those other lives would have been imposed as opposed to this life. For the goal to be an absence, a total absence of all life, there must exist a positive absence. Otherwise, no such goal exists to obtain. There is no finish line. Just like if you think about everywhere your eyes do not see, the back of your head where your eyes cannot see isn't blackness. It isn't some kind of positive non-sight, or however I should say that. I'm not sure how to word that exactly, but there isn't anything obtainable back there to rest your vision, to give you a break of vision. You can close your eyes, but still, when you close your eyes, there's still experience, an experience of looking at the inside of your eyelids. But as long as there's consciousness for you, when consciousness is occurring, there is no escape from, if you have eyes, there's no escape from sight. But even a blind person cannot escape experience of some sort, as long as that specific brain exists. So I'm pointing out that, again, there is no goal to achieve, even if all life in the universe doesn't exist. I'm not saying it's pointless to reduce life. I'm just pointing out why the asymmetry argument is deeply flawed, and it's actually snake oil. It's a deepity. It offers nothing. It's completely nonsensical. But you said you're not interested in debunking the asymmetry argument. So that's actually what the only thing I'm really interested in. Because yes, we can reduce lives numerically. I personally don't think we should end, if we were able to end all life in the universe, and imposing antinatalism on the natural world, animals, and whatever else might exist out there in the universe. So it comes down to the question of when the heat death of our universe occurs, will that be the complete and utter end, a never-ending end? I personally don't think so. I subscribe to the idea of the universe being endless, and that we can't see beyond a certain point, so we have no idea what is beyond that point that we cannot see. And so that would eventually lead to the multiverse. And I agree with Roger Penrose that our universe will repeat, or there will be some kind of universe that replaces us, yet another one. Either way, the multiverse, or a repetition of universes, is what I believe will occur. I don't believe that forever ever ends. Forever never ends. And so eventually, the very processes that brought about this universe will eventually occur again, because those very same conditions existed before this universe existed. It's merely the existence of space itself that eventually brought about our universe. So this is the inevitable question of antinatalism because of GSC. Will our universe come to an end? Will there be universes after ours? And I believe there's the multiverse, and so there is inevitably other life out there in other universes. And so there would be no escape whatsoever from consciousness coming after your non-existence, just as there was no way to stop a consciousness coming after the last time you didn't exist, due to a brain coming to exist and doing consciousness. So it seems we're just going to keep repeating this conversation. I'm going to keep saying there's no positive absence, so there's no finish line to this race. Yes, we can numerically lower consciousnesses, but there will still be no end to experience itself. So I believe I've said everything I need to say on this. So if you have anything else to say.
Okay, so absence in general just means that it includes both an experienced absence and a non-experienced absence. So, for example, what I mean by that is an absence of negative feeling in the form of both positive feeling and in the form of non-sentience. Also, just to reiterate for the audience, I am on board with what you're saying about GSC, and of course I agree that if it isn't this life, then it's another. Well, to some extent, depending on the specifics, not fully guaranteed. However, you may think it disputes the asymmetry argument, which it may or may not, but of course I'm not really specifically in favor of that argument anyways, since as I stated at the beginning that it's missing context for me to gain a full picture. And I do know that your main points of contention regarding antinatalism is mostly with Benatarian antinatalism, but I believe it's worth mentioning that I think GSC does nothing to rule out a framework of overall reducing and preventing negative feeling. Now, I do believe that we could have touched a bit on why you think we shouldn't cause all life to go extinct, let's say, even if we had a guarantee somehow that it wouldn't arise again. However, I know you want to end it here to prevent it from being an overly repetitive conversation. Plus, I believe it's been lasting a while already anyways. So I suppose we'll sign off here like you mentioned. So the last thing I want to end with, I guess, is to restate that an endpoint remains as such regardless of whom or what it is obtained by. And a goal in one's mind I would describe as just a desired endpoint. So this was a nice conversation that we had. I think it might have been a little more structured had we listed out specific prompts prior to having it, but maybe someday we can have another conversation going more in depth into frameworks and extinction overall. But nonetheless, it turned out well, and thanks. I appreciate you being here.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me. And yeah, maybe we can talk about this more.